Hi, Marcy. So nice to have you with us today.
Great to see you, Paula.
Yeah. So, yeah, I'm so grateful for everything, all the teaching that you've provided us with through the Unified Mindfulness community. I know you're very active in that, and I've learned so much myself from that community, really benefited from the group. So thank you for that. And I'm just really excited to get to know you a little bit better, get to know about your mindfulness journey. So why don't we start there? Why don't you tell us a little bit about how you started with mindfulness practice, what was going on in your life, what were you hoping for, and what did you do? Let's just start at the beginning.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I'll just be really candid about that. It was really just because I was in recovery, a 12-step program for addiction, and having some kind of practice is a part of traditional 12-step programs. And I was fortunate to have a strong community. I took it very seriously. I had great results in my recovery community. And so I was just looking for what was going to work for me. Um, the idea of being more settled down was probably my vague idea of what meditation would be about. That appealed to me, but I wouldn't have I wouldn't have thought it was possible at that time, but I had started to experience a lot of what I wouldn't have thought was possible for me, was my life starting to come together and things getting worked out. So I just really went on a search. I knew a lot of people who practiced with different teachers and different methods, and I was just trying everything. So I tried a lot of probably pretty unusual stuff and went and saw people channeling and drove out to Riverside to sit with a Jane teacher, and pretty much I just tried everything. I went to a big event with Jack Kornfield, a big event with Eckhart Tolle, a talk with Byron Katie, and
Wow.
and then was just trying to practice on my own too, and asking everybody I knew, how do you practice? How do you practice? And I just was determined to, grow this part of my life, but I didn't really know what I was looking for. I did notice that I appreciated when I started listening to Jack Kornfield recordings, and I was always an avid reader, so I'd read his books. And I really liked the attention he gave to ordinary thinking, which I had a ton of, like most people. And I appreciated that I didn't have to get rid of it because I
Mm-hmm.
couldn't at that time, of course. So, so I liked that. So I knew I had an affinity for this Vipassana style. And then I had a friend who had known Shinzen for a long time, the teacher who created the Unified Mindfulness system. So Shinzen had a long time ago lived out here near where I live in the Los Angeles area, and he was still coming out a lot to do retreats out here in Southern California. And my friend had sat with him years before, so she took me to a public talk of his in 2004. And it's funny, it did take me a long time after that to start doing more intensive practice, but I just remember that day. I just did a day long with Shinzen, and the way he spoke so clearly about how meditation works and why it works and what to do about it. He talked about the 3 attentional skills that we always talk about in Unified Mindfulness: concentration, clarity, and equanimity. And it was like, Eureka, I understand. And it just, like Shenzhen says, took the mist out of mysticism.
Mm-hmm.
So I was like, this is fantastic. But I still did not establish a daily practice. It was like I was sold, but I still didn't really know how. So I just tried. I kept trying. I kept, looking for teachers, and slowly I realized I really wanted that direct contact. I really wanted to have some feedback directly into my practice. And so I realized that I found it unsatisfying or not helpful enough to be in a big auditorium where there might be hundreds of people and I couldn't get any direct interaction with the teacher. So then when Shenzhen started the home practice program in 2008, I started doing that phone-in program that still continues now once a month. And then finally in 2012, I started retreating and doing intensive practice. That I think was the real game changer. So it was the intensive retreat doing a week that everything changed. And that was the point at which I realized this is for me. I found my thing. I got to do this. And I have no idea how I'm going to make that happen because I had 3 kids at home.
Oh, wow.
I didn't have the money. I didn't have the time. But something changed in me at that retreat. And I realized, I think we would just call it an insight. Like I had this insight and it clicked that the possibilities that I thought before were maybe just for a saint or, a 1 in 10 million people to have this kind of clarity and a sense of freedom in your life. All of a sudden I thought, well, this is everybody's birthright. Wow. This is available to me. And I just didn't know. And then it's like, once I knew, it was just, I'm going to do whatever it takes. So it really took off from there. I did whatever I had to do to keep retreating and wound up doing 20 retreats within a few years. And
wow,
I really threw myself into it. So that's kind of the origin of practice for me. And then just like you indicated in our private conversation earlier, it did change from there because I was doing so much. Of course it changed, but Shenzhen was my entry into understanding finally, like, yes, this is really going to radically change my life for the better, and I'm all in.
Wow. What a beautiful story, Marcy. Thank you for sharing. So just a question for you. So 2012, you started doing the intensive retreats. And when was around what time would you say you started the search? You said you met Shinzen in 2004. Just to give people kind of like an overview of that it takes a long time to kind of find your way, right? Like when would you say you started like your search and you had so much motivation, right? Because it sounds like you wanted to minimize suffering. Like you had a lot of suffering in your mind and with the addictions, and you were looking for something, but didn't quite know what. So around what time was that?
Yeah. I think I have an even harder time answering that precisely than many people. I hear people all the time say, I've been meditating for 10 years or 20 years, or they know a date. And I'm more like in the camp of, I was always drawn to truth and self-discovery and interested in what lies behind what we can see and the goodness of people and all kinds of things that we might call, things that seem spiritual, but I just didn't know where to go for it. I didn't, grow up in a family that put a lot of value on that kind of thing. And so I just didn't know. So it all kind of blended together. And really, I think being in recovery gave me that place to have this clear reason that this needs to happen now. And I had more presence of mind just by a function of being healthier, being mentally and emotionally and physically healthier was required for me to be able to settle down enough to even do something like that. So that was in 2002 when I got sober. Yeah. And by 2004, I was like, okay, this meditation thing is the center of my practice now.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, and when you were searching, were there some guideposts along the way? Like you said, when you met Shinzen, it just connected. Was it more that it needed to make sense for you, the practice or the clear direction?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say I know that in retrospect, and I didn't know what I was looking for until I found it. And I think for me, a lot of that had to do with it is what you're saying, but I think under that too is because there was a sense of safety in that. Like what my mind couldn't understand at all didn't feel safe. I didn't want something weird. I didn't want to be involved in a cult. I didn't want to be taken advantage of or lose myself as at that time a young woman. And so it was just that it was so pragmatic and it was easy to understand.
Yes.
And I think that was like very delicious and calming and satisfying for like the analytical mind to just say, oh, this makes sense. And then I could relax and stop struggling so much and trying to figure things out.
Yeah, I love that. That's something I love about Shinzen's approach too. That it's makes sense, like it's logical, and it's science based. So it's like a real thing. You're doing something that even though it's hard to, it's not tangible because you're training your mind, and the mind is not. It's not something that we can see like we can see our muscles, but it's like you get clear on what it is that you're actually doing. Because I don't know if this was your experience, but it was definitely mine that those first meditation experiences don't feel so blissful, right? Like we're looking for more ease and more joy, I guess, or freedom. But at first it can feel like a struggle, right? Was that your experience as well, that it wasn't easy?
Yeah, in fact, I've never had a tendency toward bliss.
Yeah.
I know a lot of people do. And, wonderful if that's someone else's experience. But yeah, that was never my experience. It was I remember when I heard him speak about the three attentional skills, I thought, oh my gosh, I can learn to concentrate. That would be amazing because I experienced myself as being very scattered and not able to follow through, not able to stay motivated and do the things I had set my mind to doing. And then, of course, then that had a vicious cycle. Then I would have a low self opinion because of not doing what I intended to do. And what I heard in his talk was just super practical. It was like, oh, mindfulness isn't only this spiritual thing that we can't talk about. It's also this very practical thing that you'll see results in your daily life, in your ordinary circumstances. And so because that made sense and I knew I needed that, I just totally believed him. It was reasonable. So it was like, yeah, I'm in. I'm going to see that. And somewhere, I can't remember how you just said it, but in your question about, what we're looking for, and we don't, maybe don't have great experiences right away, but I could see that just the ordinary experiences that, that would change because I had had that experience in recovery. Like I had already learned that when I do certain things differently than I have before, change happens and I improve in ways I didn't even know I needed to improve, much less that I could improve. So it's like once I understood what mindfulness was, I had just utter trust and faith in the process. And then it did take a couple years after that, but I had like a great springboard because I just knew it was going to work, and it was just a matter of not giving up before I started seeing results. And then, of course, eventually I got tremendous results.
Yeah. Oh, wonderful. Yeah, there's a level of trust, I guess, that's required at the beginning. And you had also mentioned in your story the importance of moving from just say a big audience or some, like these days it would be maybe like something you find on YouTube or something, to having like an actual personal connection with a teacher, right? That you found that made a big difference.
Yeah, and that, and I guess that's remained a part of my own signature. Like I didn't know that it was before, I was just feeling into what was going to work for me. And this is my experience of most teachers in general, is they teach what works for them, you know? So just like you have this theme with MT mindfulness, it's, you know, whatever works for anybody. So for me, I really needed and thrived on direct contact. And then that has stayed the core of how I work too. The most important thing to me as a teacher is having direct contact with people that I'm coaching, because everybody's different. And then you get to specifically, you know, address what's going on for this person, not just a technique, but their background, the context, you know, what they like, what's working for them, so that, you know, being able to be around Shenzhen 3 times a year at first for those retreats. And a couple of things, you know, being in a room with them and just listening and taking in the way he expressed, like that's a teaching too. And then having the one-on-one times when I would get that experience of his offering something to my individual practice. All of that was really helpful, especially those first 2 years. It was huge for that time.
Yeah, so great. So I don't know if this is this the case for you, but sometimes I find I've been meditating in a particular way, or something's worked, but either something in my life shifts, or it's just not working the same way, or there's something that comes up emotionally that's hard to work with. So are those the kinds of things that Shinzen would help with? What were your interactions with him like? Like, did he give you what to practice, or you knew what to practice and he gave you tips, or how did that go?
Yeah, that's an interesting question for me too, because I thought you were going one place and then you went another. So I'm trying to keep track of both, because it wasn't so much my experience there. And then after a couple of years, I did need to really branch out and get other input that I needed, which is, I think, what you're asking about. So the first couple of years when I had the most just training with Shenzhen, a lot of this was these spikes in attentional skills, so that those one-on-one interactions coming with very specific, really technical questions about my practice, this is what's happening when I practice, what should I do? This is a type of distraction or a type of mental challenge or emotional challenge. What strategies should I apply? So I was really focused on just the nuts and bolts of my formal meditation practice when I would talk to him. And I think, that was different from a lot of people I knew who had known him in the earlier years for the past couple decades, where he had helped them a lot, even, with whatever was coming up in their life. And I think it was maybe just different for me because I had a strong community and foundation in recovery. So it was like I had another place where I was doing that. And then when I was going for meditation, I was just really focused on my technique and my strategy and deepening my skills and whatever practice I was doing. So he would just, talk to me about, well, try focus in here and try doing in and out at the same time, and I'll be back in 10 minutes and tell me what happened. So we do things like that. Although there was a time, I'm glad I remembered to tell you this though, that after I started intensive retreating, I did have a resurgence of panic attacks after I'd been free from them for about 10 years. And now I know that this is not an uncommon thing for a dedicated practitioner to have, as some kind of unpleasant or adverse reaction to intensive practice. The great thing was that I, had been I had such a stable base going into it and felt really well supported. I just thought, wow, something is really wrong with me. I'm having difficulty. I feel afraid, just generalized fear and, this nervousness. And so I called Shenzhen from home, which he used to encourage that and say, if you have any trouble, call me. I tended to have so much trouble after retreats that became the thing that I did for many years after that, was like, if anybody has trouble on retreat, call me, because Shenzhen stopped offering that service. And then I've offered that service for a long time because I know how it is. But that was a time when he was a huge help. And I got to see that in the moment support with something like that when I called him and explained that I was having trouble and I needed help. And he asked first, what the indicators were. And I told him about my breathing and my heart rate and my mind state. And he was very responsible. He asked first if I, needed medical help, if I had any conditions like this. And then I said, no, I don't. I mean, I used to. I've been treated. I'm not being treated now. And I know I can do this if you'll just tell me what to do. And he trusted my clarity. And then so we were on the phone, but I was at home. And he, give me a practice to do for 10 minutes. Do this, call me back, do this, call me back. So he was teaching me how to disentangle and focus on one thing at a time to calm my nervous system. And, that was one of many just huge transformative experiences I had working with him directly. Some of them were on retreat. I've had small breakthroughs, big breakthroughs, several times by doing that phone work with him that were amazing. That one is something that I think a lot of people can relate to, this kind of intense anxiety. And I can't overstate how empowering it is to find out that, that I can work through that with mindfulness, with doing a technique. And certainly it's made me a better coach and a better teacher because, I've been through that too. So it's like I feel pretty clear on, what I'm qualified to manage and what I'm not. And I'm really comfortable in those arenas.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a couple things in there that I'd love to unpack. So you mentioned disentangle, and we at MT Mindfulness teach Shinzen's technique of see, hear, and feel. So just to clarify for people, that would mean to kind of take out what are you seeing, what are you feeling, what are you hearing, and that helps to kind of lower the anxiety. Is that how you would explain it, or how would you explain
Yeah,
it?
exactly.
Yeah.
So he had me do one sense category at a time, and to help not get so overwhelmed, because what we call the inner system of thoughts and emotions, my inner system was just going crazy. And what we know is there's like a critical mass, and if people get past a certain point, then this is, what you'd call in trauma sensitive mindfulness, like this, once you're in hyper arousal, it's kind of like it's too late. You might need help getting regulated. But once he taught me that in real time, then I became able to do that for myself too. I got better and better at seeing where I was approaching getting out of my window of tolerance, and I could focus on one thing at a time instead of letting my mind jump around to all of these different places. But I know too, when I started meditating, I didn't have that capacity. I didn't have enough concentration and clarity to know that my mind was jumping around, to know how to focus it on one thing at a time.
Totally. And the other thing that I think is interesting, and it's kind of related, is that a lot of the times the challenges we go through, we then end up being able to help others, right? Because there's so many things that might come up and we say, oh no, this is coming up and I wish it wasn't, right? Like whether it's anger or sadness or fear. But then it's an opportunity, if we can have the right support, to learn how to navigate through, and also have that balance. I love that you said, Marcy, that he asked you, what's the medical, do you have medical support as well? Like, I know for me, with depression, a lot of times I would go on these long retreats before I met Shinzen, and then I would come out like more depressed, and they were like, oh, no problem, you're just kind of processing through. But it's like, but I need to go to work, and I need to, and so I did take, some medication, I had some help with that, and that they both can go together, that we can get the supports we need to come back into our window of tolerance, and then we can also use these tools to feel less overwhelmed, I guess, right? Yeah. So that's so great. So then you had these retreat experiences with Shinzen, and what was happening at home? How did you find the time to do them? And what was it like when you came back from them? Did you have a family at that time, or was it before your family? Like, how was everything at home?
Yeah, it was very challenging. But I learned pretty quickly that at that time, when I was going to a lot of Shenzhen retreats, I was the only regular with little kids at home. And there had been other people, in and out, but, just not at that time. Nobody who lived nearby me, because I don't live in Los Angeles, I live in the suburbs. And there was just nothing. And I think, my major focus then was, I have to get this practice well established. And I talked to every facilitator at retreats. People would volunteer to coach. I talked to all of them. Juliana, who's the head trainer at Unified Mindfulness, she was my personal coach for a couple of years. So I did a lot of things to try to establish that practice. Some people said, oh, do Insight Timer and you can collect these stars, but I found that I'm not motivated by stars, but I am motivated by accountability. So having a coach helped me. And then I made some friends at the retreats, and my one friend, who's still my very best friend because we share a passion for practice, I knew that he did a sitting group every morning. And so he sat every morning at 6:00, no matter what. So I asked him if I could sit at that time every day and just send him a text and, to say, I'm sitting with you, I'm sitting with you. And so I hooked into somebody else's practice to establish my own practice. And I got up earlier. I had, the 3 kids, and it was not realistic for me to find a time once the day got going. So I made the time in the morning every day. And there were just ongoing ups and downs. So whenever I came back from retreat, you might relate to this, Paula, based on what you said a minute ago, was, I'd come back and I would just feel wide open and very connected to my family, and like, oh my gosh, I am currently the best version of myself, but it would only last for about 24 hours. And then I'd be devastated, because it was like knowing how much better I could be and not being able to maintain it. That was the hard part, but it was motivating because I knew what was possible. And it was just, it's difficult to come back into everyday life and be bombarded by our normal responsibilities. It's a lot.
Yes.
Yeah.
So you had your formal practice. You woke up early. I do the same, because that's kind of the only time where there's some quiet. And then did you do informal practice during the day? What did that look like for you?
Yeah, I did wherever I could during the day too, but really, I was usually only really motivated by suffering. So, if I was in enough pain, I would do anything. And I focused on formal practice, I think, because my primary interest had always been insight. Like I really wanted to get to the bottom of this thing and find out what's what. Let's see how far this goes. So that was very much my nature. And the funny thing is, I really didn't appreciate the value of informal practice until I started teaching. And when I started, there was a strong interest at my kids' school because mindfulness has become so well known. A lot of people want this in schools. And so I started there, started teaching at school to parents and kids and teachers. And, and I introduced the standard program that we teach at Unified Mindfulness, and it includes informal practice. And I was blown away when I taught this to parents and they picked it up immediately. And they would come back the next week and go, I taught this to my son as we were driving to school. And I did this when my chicken died. And I did this when I was in the ER. And I was like, wow, this is really useful. It's funny because that was really the game changer for me. And I think it also speaks to how in Unified Mindfulness, we talk about the pillars of practice and how helpful it is to ourselves to be, sharing whatever we can, however we're interested in doing it with others too. And that benefited me so much. So by teaching others was the way I became a believer in informal practice. So it was really, years into it before I really went, wow, that's amazing, actually. And then I started getting more interested in not only using it in times of suffering. And now I think it's really just kind of an all the time thing. Like I love to just be attentive to what's really going on right now instead of making it something I do outside of life. Now it's like, well, that's the nature of attention, always wanting to be attentive to what's happening right now.
Yeah, that was a big game changer for me as well because with busy lives, sometimes having a long practice, and I used to really try, and I was really tired also. If you wake up too early and then you're meditating and then you're up, late doing stuff, it can be tiring. But this idea that your formal practice really can be 10 minutes, and then informal practice, just 30 seconds to 2 minutes of a micro hit, and it can be when you're walking the dog or when you're with your kids. Or the background practice that you can just have 20% of your attention on, the sensations in your body, like feel in while you're in a meeting, right? Or when you're cooking, or somebody, Campbell also from Unified Mindfulness, taught me feel rest when you're doing the dishes at night, because I said I'm so tired by the end of the day, I don't have time to practice. She's like, well, what are you doing? Well, I'm doing the dishes and making lunch. So now I do feel rest when I'm making lunch and doing the dishes in the evening, which is amazing. Yeah, and I wanted to ask you about the other pillars, which you've touched on, because you have accountability, so you're getting support and then you're giving support for when you're teaching. So do you want to talk a little bit about those pillars?
So do you mean just those two or all the pillars? We also have, the practice, daily practice, and intensive practice. So for me, intensive practice now is primarily with my Zen teacher. So I'm a Rinzai Zen teacher, and I practice at the Zen temple whenever I can. And to me, it's really important to my style of practice, what my interests are, that intensive practice. But I love how it doesn't have to be that, to your point about informal practice. And now, I encourage people all the time. I always talk about informal practice. I just didn't understand the value early on. And same thing with intensive practice. Like that can just be, the home practice program that I talked about earlier that's been going on since 2008. Like you can do intensive practice by calling into a phone meeting for 2 hours. So that one's huge.
Yes.
It just, it just gives a lot of momentum that's really difficult to get any other way. So it's like having a personal trainer,
Right.
getting that intensive practice really increases motivation and gives you like a taste of how clear things can be, how good you can feel, how easy it can be to concentrate. But yeah, giving support and getting support, I think I do both every single day. I don't think there are any days that I don't. Yeah, and
That's
they're,
great.
they're all one thing. It's so wonderful
Mm-hmm.
to talk about practice because it's my absolute passion. So it's hard
So
to even
great.
disambiguate, getting support from giving support.
Yeah, that's so lovely. Yeah, and I love how over time, just the presence itself is like support. Like just seeing you and your way helps me calm my nervous system, and we just kind of all support each other.
Mm-hmm.
Great. So I just have a couple more questions. I'd be curious to learn a little bit about the Zen that you're doing now, how you found that, and what that's like.
Mm-hmm.
So you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. When I was going to a lot of Shinzen retreats, there were a couple of things. One was there was an old student of his who had a large property in Ojai, which isn't far from me, and they had weekend retreats. So I was supplementing my unified mindfulness practice with, whatever else I could fill in. I was going there. It was kind of Zen style, but also Shinzen had for many years been the Japanese translator for Sasaki Roshi, who was the longtime Roshi of Rinzai Ji here in the Los Angeles area. And because of that, he talked about him a lot at retreats, and there were several people who he'd recommended to that community, including Juliana and another friend of mine who I'd known here, and our kids went to school together for a little while. So, so I asked them about that, and it suited my personality immediately. Which this may sound awful to some people, but when my friend Maggie said, like, "Oh well, there's so much structure and everything you do together, everybody eats the same way, you walk in the building together, you walk out the same way, you're always in line. Any mistakes that you'll get corrected." She described it a little bit to me, and because I'd already done a lot of retreats, the connection I made was like, oh, the simple environment that allows me to drop all my daily distractions and work on this deep, subtle stuff I never have time to sit with, time to work through. I could hear how what Rinzai Zen was doing was taking that way up. That it's like, we're going to take this up to the nth degree until you don't need to decide anything. It's all decided for you. There's nothing optional in the program. And you can tell, this is my own interpretation now, having been a practitioner for several years, is uh, we work alone as meditators, building our attentional skills and noticing when we might be distracted and bringing our attention back. And in Rinzai Zen practice in particular, anytime your attention wavers, it's immediately visible to everyone because you've lost the thread of what you're supposed to be doing. So if we're sitting in formal practice, if we're chanting, if we're doing meals, if we're doing yard work, the moment our attention isn't where it's supposed to be, we'll miss something. And so it's a training. It's a very intensive training in attentional skill building, which, in unified mindfulness, we say that's what all contemplative traditions are doing. They just talk about it in different ways. So I heard that, I understood from her description, oh, this could be a huge accelerator. It sounded beautiful to me. It made my heart sing. So I started training at Mount Baldy here in Los Angeles, and I just loved it immediately. It was really hard, and I needed a challenge. Like, I wanted a challenge. I had that kind of personality that was like, all right, I want something harder. I want to feel like I'm really working for it. And I had a taste for that sense of working hard and having a payoff. And, and the payoff is then when you can see something so beautiful and clear in an ordinary experience, a pine cone or an egg or an electrical outlet, and being so enraptured by something ordinary, that is the experience of the attentional skills being really heightened. And so, I was seeing how the Zen environment was developing my skills faster and with more precision than I had been doing. So I liked that. And I had already been looking into, too, when I was still retreating on site with Shenzhen, I became really interested in Advaita and in Zen, and was just reading Nisargadatta and Ramana Maharshi, the great Advaita teachers, and getting into those, reading and feeling a lot of just resonance with those styles. And Zen is still pretty not that hard to find a traditional teacher. It's there's a lot of modern Advaita teachers, but not as easy to find very traditional Advaita teachers. And so the Zen was something I could do. Now then, that Roshi is no longer living, and the Roshi I was practicing with was visiting from Japan. So it took a few more years to find my current teacher, Ursula Durand, who teaches at her temple in Northern California. And she had trained in Japan when she was young for many years. And I love having a female teacher too. It's amazing. When I met her and, felt the power and clarity of her presence, and being a woman able to have this way of communicating without a single wasted or excess breath or syllable was incredible, just incredible to experience. And so that's my main teacher now, is Ursula Durand.
Oh, that's so beautiful. And it's so interesting to see how we're drawn to, right? Like that you're drawn to the structure and it really called to you. And so then you tried it, and then you found one teacher, and then it leads to something else. And it's truly a journey, right? Like it's a lifelong
Right.
discovery and deepening. Beautiful.
Yeah.
And
And still,
yeah.
I know that, sometimes we meet a lot of people in Unified Mindfulness who come to Unified Mindfulness from Zen. So sometimes people practice a tradition for a long time that doesn't have a lot of explanation or a lot of precision in language or pragmatic discussion about everyday life. And so I feel like they're such a great complement, because it can be a very, esoteric or feel kind of religious, or why do we do this kind of a thing. And so I love that, I have this framework of unified mindfulness that, that's a great way to meet people and to talk to people about what's happening or how this can benefit, while at the same time my own, what's fueling me and what's feeding me and makes me feel resourced is my Zen practice, but I can explain it to people with unified mindfulness terminology so that we're all speaking like plain English, because Zen tends to speak in poetry.
Yeah, that's so good. And another beauty of the unified mindfulness, when I started to do more intense unified mindfulness, I said, well, I already have a yoga practice, so do I need to add this on? And somebody said, oh, no. You can take the practice that you're doing, whether it's Zen or yoga, and if you bring the unified mindfulness lens to it, you can see it kind of in a new way. But it's all Unified Mindfulness kinds of brings in all these different practices into their umbrella. So it's not like an extra, right? It's nice. Just
Right, right.
yeah, beautiful. And what would you maybe tell us a little bit about what life is like now and what you would want to share with people about whether it's your journey or mindfulness in general or how they can get started or grow in their practice?
hmm Well, I'll tell you what comes to mind, and then you can let me know if I'm answering the question the way you intended. So, I mean, what comes to mind for me when you say like, what would you want to share? It's very aligned with what what you and David and Mitch said at the beginning to me earlier, that this is for everybody. Like, nobody needs to be a Zen practitioner or a Vipassana practitioner, or, it's like this is all just improving our functioning, being more skillful in the way that's meaningful to us. And, there are myriad ways that we can meet those needs and those desires. And so I work in many ways myself. And as you know, I work with Unified Mindfulness and I train teachers. I do administrative work for them. I do all kinds of things at Unified Mindfulness. And I've worked for them for several years now. And I have my own ventures, and they're both. I work in both secular and what could be called non-secular ways. So I love I have a real heart for traditional practice and people who just love meditation and want to find out how deep it goes. Who am I really? And explore those questions. And I have a center now. I founded a nonprofit with my best friend, Louis Wild. And our nonprofit is called the Center for Contemplative Enrichment. I can give you all the website later. And so it wants to serve a couple of purposes, just to support primarily people like all of you too, people who are meditators, who are seeking to use that experience and passion to do good in the world, to support other people. And what he and I saw when we were doing a lot of retreating was this gap for well, who's supporting these people? Well, where's the community for those of us who just love this and, we're looking where's my people? What about a retreat for me? And this kind of thing. So we aim to have on-site retreats for small numbers of people. And I do a lot of private coaching, primarily for very dedicated meditators, people who are really serious about their practice, but they need some input, just like I, wanted so much at the beginning and I didn't know what I was looking for. So I'm a huge believer in that one-on-one support. And that's, probably just about my favorite thing I do is I do a lot of private coaching. And then at the same time, because I have those kids and I started teaching first in the schools, I also saw this big gap in schools around educators not really knowing what mindfulness really was. They were using what they'd heard about as a classroom management strategy, but they were really just thinking about it as calming down and missing the profound benefits of training attention. And it's well, what could educators want more than a room full of students who are learning to pay attention well? But we have to learn how to pay attention before we can teach people how to pay attention. So because of that experience, I also created my approach called Embodied Teaching, and I've taught classes on that, and I have a home study class available, and I have books coming out both on Embodied Teaching and on my more non-secular work that's called Conversations on the Path. So I love, like, there are no limits to this kind of work we do. It's like whatever you love. Early on in my experience in the Unified Mindfulness community, sometimes, as we were training coaches, people would say, "Oh, isn't the market flooded?" It's like, no, it's wide open, because anything you love is related to mindfulness. And, sometimes when I coach people, they'll say, "Oh, I'm sorry to bring this up. I'm not sure if it's related to practice." And I always say, as far as I'm concerned, everything's related to practice. So you can tell me what you want to tell me, and I can show you how that's related to practice. So, I love that now it's like, yeah, now I'm, really getting my own thing established where I can keep doing this work, where I see a great need. I see um, this opportunity and responsibility to fill in some gaps that it's just a pleasure, because there's nothing I love more than that. So so those are some of the things I'm doing, and I have my family, I have my kids, and I would say I am a an exponentially better mother to my two younger kids than I was to my older one when she was young, because of practice. Because I am so transformed. I have been sober for 20 years, and that had to happen for everything else good in my life to happen. And at the same time, I would say that becoming a dedicated practitioner has been by far the biggest transformation. That has changed me so deeply and continues to change me, that I can't help but, how could I do anything else? How could I do anything else but be available? And like Shenzhen says sometimes, if he ever got put out of work, it would be for the best possible reason, because no one was suffering anymore. So I'm never concerned about not having anything to do. There's always plenty for us to do, being able to support people in developing these skills that just, there's bumps along the way, but as long as we support each other in that, then we can always see that, the positives blow the difficulties out of the water, when we just stay a steady course and, work through the challenges that are inevitable as we come across, whatever we've been trying to avoid in our mind or our feelings. And we can work through those things with mindfulness. So,
Beautiful.
I don't know.
Well, we're so grateful.
Did that answer?
Absolutely. We're so grateful for your support and your wisdom. And just thank you so much for sharing your story with us. Is there anything else you wanted to talk about? I feel very full from my end. So very grateful.
Yeah, it's been great, Paula. I'm sure there's nothing I'd rather talk about. So rather than go on for 6 more hours, I think I'll let it go. Whatever was not said can be unsaid.
Yes. Thank you, Marcy.
Thanks, Paula. I'll see you soon.
See you soon.